Welcome to Lesson 2. This one is really the trail map for our hike. So we've prepped and we've got our gear ready, we've talked about some guidelines and some rules, and now the adventure really begins. When I first shared my Fast Track to Solids approach on the Can Do Kiddo blog, I referred to each different texture as a phase, and I numbered them, Phase 1, Phase 2, Phase 3, and so on. But I think this led some to feel like the Fast Track approach was really rigid or prescriptive, and it's definitely not. I truly want you to see that the goal of a table food diet is really the peak of a mountain with many different trails to the top. And just like when hiking or mountain biking or skiing, some trails are rated for beginners and others are for those with more experience and more mastery. By really understanding how different textures rank in order of difficulty and in order of oral motor challenge, you can best navigate your way to the top with your own child. I want you to know that if you start down a trail and realize it's too tricky for your baby, you can always back up to a more familiar path for a while. I'll also share some alternate paths to try if you hit a stuck point. So if one beginner trail isn't working for your baby, there are other beginner trails to try. Or if you've been on the same texture of foods for a bit and baby's doing well, you can try a more challenging path and see how it goes. So let's take a peek at how different foods rank in difficulty. Our beginner foods are smooth purees, which are what we typically think of as Stage 1 and Stage 2 baby foods. Fork mashed foods, which have the texture of being pre-chewed. And solid foods in a mesh or silicone feeder. Our more intermediate foods include dissolvable solids and mashable solids. Dissolvable solids are those that soften even if you put them in your mouth and do nothing. Mashable solids don't require organized chewing. Our advanced foods are easy chewable and easy crunchable foods, and mixed textures. And finally, our experts-only foods are tough chewables. As we talk about transitioning between textures, I'll be keeping these trail symbols in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen to give you a reminder of what level of difficulty we're talking about. So let's start with baby's first feeding adventure, those smooth purees. You'll get your spoons out, you'll put baby in his high chair, you'll let him play as usual while you get that single ingredient puree ready. Smooth purees can be thin and runny or thicker with more of a yogurt or pudding consistency, and when I first introduced the Fast Track to Solids on the blog, I differentiated between the two, but a lot of parents got really hung up on figuring out which was which. Both thin and thick purees are developmentally fine for new eaters, so you can choose either for your baby's first adventures in tasting. You'll begin by just dipping the tip of a spoon in puree and putting the spoon on the tray or in baby's hands to explore, just like you saw in the baby-led spoon feeding videos of the last lesson. Here's some ways your baby might react to this first feeding adventure. He may bang the spoon, drop the spoon, bring it to his cheek or his nose or his forehead instead of his mouth. Or in the course of playing, he might wind up with food on his fingers, which he then might like to taste, either by accident or on purpose. He may not even bring the spoon to his mouth at all. Your baby looks to you to learn, so modeling what to do can be really helpful. Show baby how you take a bite, slowly and enthusiastically. You can always have a different food if your baby's food isn't appealing to you. I've been known to be eating Nutella from a spoon while baby eats sweet potatoes. If your baby is doing a lot of play but not tasting his food, you might try gently touching the spoon to his lips like we talked about in the last lesson, as long as he's not pushing it away or turning his head away. Just remember, no forcing the spoon into a mouth that's not open. You might also try dropping a small dollop of puree right on his tray to touch and smear and maybe to taste from his fingers. What types of things might your baby do when he gets his first taste of food, or a new flavor, or a new texture in his mouth? He might make a silly face, or look like he hates it. He might gag, or he might shiver. That's all normal, and it doesn't mean that your baby doesn't like the food. Just look at the big reaction this new food got from my little one, but she reaches for the spoon and leans in for another taste. Babies can surprise us by looking absolutely repulsed by a food and then reaching for the spoon for more. Science shows that it can take 20 or more exposures to a food before a baby really knows if they like it or not. And my parenting experience has been that what baby loves or hates can completely change a few weeks or months later. So even if you offer a bunch of times and think, well, he doesn't like green beans, try them again in a month or two. This first meal and the next few meals might be 5 minutes of playing and 2 or 3 tastes. That is totally fine. Remember that these first months of eating are primarily for tasting and exploring, even as your baby progresses through different textures. He's still gaining all those benefits we talked about in the introduction to this course, so this is important work he's doing. The cue to move on to more difficult textures is not that your baby is eating spoonful after spoonful of his current food texture. Instead, the biggest clue that your little one is ready for his next adventure in eating is that he opens for a spoon some of the time. It's as simple as that. Once you notice your baby brings the spoon to his mouth some during meals, or opens for the spoon from you, or with a little help from you, then it's on to the next adventure. It's your cue that your little one is ready for more than a dip. He's ready to try a bite or a spoonful of puree. Again, you can use a combination of baby-led spoon feeding and respectful spoon feeding to offer these first real bites. How long will it take for your baby to willingly open for the spoon? Some babies will gladly eat most anything you put in front of them. That was my firstborn. He moved through each texture in a matter of days. But plenty of babies are less enthusiastic, like my secondborn. When we moved past a dipped spoon, she would get a little bite of puree and immediately spit it out or gag, for weeks. If it's been several weeks, and your baby really doesn't seem any more interested in bringing the spoon to his mouth or opening for a taste from you, then you might start to feel a bit stuck. Here's some strategies to try. Be sure to vary the tastes you offer. Remember to give 3 or 4 days between new foods, but remember, as we talked about in part 1, you can safely combine foods based on what your baby has already tried without reaction. You can also try offering at different temperatures. Chilled, room temperature, or a little bit warm. Baby's skin is a bit more sensitive to heat, so you never want to offer food that's truly hot, but you can certainly offer warmed foods. Another strategy for getting unstuck is changing utensils. Remember that you can experiment with different spoons. Or try dipping baby's favorite teether toy in purees. My reluctant feeder really enjoyed purees from an infant finger toothbrush that we had. So after a few meals with just the brush, I began using it more like a warm-up, and I would offer a few bites from the brush and then move successfully to small bites from a spoon. You might also try dipping your finger in food and offering that instead of a spoon. Or you might try venturing down another beginner trail. Putting solids in a feeder is another beginner trail to try. You can put in small, soft chunks of whatever foods you've picked as first foods. Baked apples, steamed carrots, or bananas, for example. A beginning feeder is likely to just suck on the feeder, like you see my little one doing here, while an older, more experienced feeder is more likely to chew or gnaw on it. And we'll talk a bit later about other times it could be used to transition to new textures. Once my hesitant eater was happily sucking on her mesh feeder, I would actually dip it in purees so that she would get used to more in her mouth. One thing that can help a lot with more reluctant eaters is what I like to call breakthrough foods. These are the foods that your little one just seems to prefer. When you find a breakthrough food, you've really struck gold. That food is a valuable tool for you, and it can help your little one progress to the next adventure. It can also tell you more about what your baby likes. Offer it daily for a few days to get some feeding momentum and experience before moving on to the next adventure. Yogurt was a breakthrough food for my reluctant eater and was the first food that she eagerly brought to her mouth. I stuck with it for a few days, and then I used it to expand what she was eating. So I used plain yogurt as a base and blended different flavors into it, and it worked. Of course, we did move past just offering yogurt after a few days, but I was able to use yogurt as a breakthrough food to get her unstuck from that tasting phase and to help her tolerate more than just a dipped spoon. Use those breakthrough foods to help you help your little one make more gradual changes in the food that they accept and eat. 2 things will let you know your kiddo is ready for his next feeding adventure. Fork mashed foods. The first is when he has 1 or more foods that he opens for and keeps most of a small bite in his mouth. It's okay if there's still some purees that he pushes out or pushes away or gags on, but you want to see a few that he's accepting or managing really well. The other indication that it might be time to venture down a new trail is if your baby has been on that puree stage for 1 to 2 months with no change in how he accepts them. If you've changed the taste and changed the temperature and changed the utensils, maybe it's time to change the texture and see if that helps. Your baby's next adventure is fork-mashed foods. For lack of a more appealing description, these are soft foods that have the consistency of being pre-chewed. It's important to keep in mind that these are not the same as mixed texture foods. Most store-bought stage 3 foods are mixed texture, and what I mean by that is a smooth puree with a few lumps and chunks in it. Mixed texture foods are more difficult, both from a sensory perspective and an oral motor perspective, so we'll save them for later. Am I saying to skip stage 3 baby foods? Possibly, yes. Or at least hold off on introducing them until baby has a little bit more experience and more skills. But if you have an enthusiastic eater who did great with purees, there's certainly no harm in trying stage 3s. If your baby likes them, onward, friends. But if your little one is slowly progressing or less enthusiastic, fork-mashed foods offer an easier next step. Fork-mashed foods have more texture than smooth purees, but it's more of a uniform texture and closer to a solid food. Some foods are easier to fork mash than others. Soft, steamed veggies like sweet potatoes and butternut squash work well. Peas and green beans don't because they tend to have a tougher skin. Raw avocado and banana work well. Raw apples do not. If you try fork mashing a food and you can't get it to the right consistency, just pick another one and move on. It's nearly impossible to find store-bought fork-mashed foods. So for this really brief stage, you'll be making your own baby food. But don't panic. This can be as simple or as elaborate as you want to make it. You can steam foods ahead of time, or you can just choose foods that are fork mash ready. Fork mashing food for your baby takes under a minute, so you can do this, I promise. Here's how. Just put a few chunks or pieces of whatever soft food you've chosen into a bowl and smash it up against the side of the bowl with your fork until it literally looks like someone chewed it up and spit it back out. This is much closer to a solid food than a puree. Not every food is this easy to fork mash, but since your baby won't be in this stage for long, just find a few that work and stick to those and combinations of them. You can begin with tiny bites of fork mashed foods from your spoon or just place them on baby's tray for touching and tasting. Even if your baby was a puree pro, he might make funny faces, gag, or shiver at this new sensation. Remember that this is normal, and as long as baby isn't upset or consistently turning away or pushing food away, it's not a sign that the meal has to stop. At every stage of the journey, you can continue to offer those textures that your baby has already mastered. In fact, that can help keep momentum up the same way that breakthrough foods can, and can help balance the new challenge of fork-mashed foods with familiar purees. Think of it like ordering one of your favorite foods as an entree in a fancy restaurant, but with an exotic new food as a side dish to try, instead of ordering a whole plate full of things you've never heard of or tasted before. The first option feels a lot less anxiety-producing, doesn't it? Just remember that blending a smooth puree with a fork-mashed food will create a mixed texture that will be much harder for your little one to accept and to manage. Again, if you have an enthusiastic eater and want to experiment with this, go for it. But if you have a more hesitant or cautious eater who tends to get stuck, I suggest keeping purees and fork-mashed foods separate and not mixed together. One fun thing you might notice is that fork-mashed foods might trigger your little one to use his tongue and his cheek muscles to move food around his mouth a bit before swallowing. This is a new skill for him. You might even see him doing some munching. That's little up and down jaw movements, which is his first real chewing. Your baby will show you he's ready for his next big adventure in eating when he opens for small bites of fork-mashed foods and keeps them in his mouth, or when your baby has been trying fork-mashed foods for several weeks with no change in how he accepts them and you feel like you're a bit stuck. It's time to give your baby a chance to work on chewing, but we want to do this with an extra measure of safety. For at least a handful of meals, I want you to offer dissolvable solids. These are those foods that even if your baby doesn't chew well or at all, they'll turn to mush in his mouth for safe swallowing. Dissolvable solids are usually man-made and designed just for babies. We're talking about baby puffs, yogurt melts, mum puffed rice rusks or wafers. Just be sure not to confuse dissolvable teething foods with toddler teething foods, like teething biscuits or cookies that are intended for older babies to gnaw and chew on. Read labels carefully for the word dissolvable and a suggested age range of 6 to 12 months. Not sure if something is a dissolvable solid? Just put it in your own mouth and move it around without chewing. Does the food begin to dissolve or melt, or does it stay in one solid piece? If these store-bought foods don't line up with your family food choices, you can either accept them as a very temporary step in your baby's feeding journey, or you can use a mesh or silicone feeder instead. Either way, this is a great time to introduce a feeder if you haven't already. You can put foods that require a bit of chewing, like halved grapes, raw apple, or peach, or ice chips in your feeder to really encourage this new important skill. Let's take a look at what's normal for this dissolvable solid stage. Here you see that baby's worked this rice rusk down to a crumbling mess. She's taking it in and out of her mouth, and some of what gets in her mouth comes right back out. And when a piece gets too far back on her tongue, you see her gag. But once she uses her tongue to move that piece over to her gums, she does a little chewing and seems pretty happy about it. She also goes in for more. It's really important not to panic or overreact when baby gags. Gagging is not the same as choking. It isn't cause for alarm, but it is a reminder to keep your full attention on your baby and make sure that that gagging does what it's intended to do to prevent choking. And if your little one has a tendency to gag a lot at new foods or textures, it's important to follow your little one's lead so that mealtimes remain positive and low stress. Since she keeps putting food in her mouth, we continue with this mealtime. Remember that you can continue to offer purees and fork-mashed foods at most meals. So typical baby meals at this age might be baby oatmeal plus a few yogurt melts, or fork-mashed avocado and a rice rusk. Even if baby only gets a few bites of each food, you can begin to offer more of a mini meal than just a taste of a single food. And you start to see how we're building baby's diet from tasting single foods to having a meal. You'll know your baby is ready for his next big adventure when he puts some bites of dissolvable solids in his mouth, chews, and swallows them. Or when he's chewing on a mesh or silicone feeder. Or if you're feeling stuck after a few weeks of trying different dissolvable solids or foods in a feeder. Next up are mashable solids. These are foods that can be easily mashed by baby's gums and tongue. They're regular table foods that are just super soft. If you can put a food in your own mouth and mash it up between your tongue and the roof of your mouth, you've got a mashable solid. Great examples are pieces of baked potatoes without the skin, beans, muffins, scrambled eggs, bananas, avocados, steamed vegetables and fruits, and milk-soaked cereal like Cheerios. The key to keeping baby's first solids safe is to cut them smaller than your pinky fingernail. Foods this small might be tricky for your little one to pick up, so you may choose to help by offering single bites of them from a spoon or from your own fingers. This is the stage where those nutritional considerations start to really come into play. By this mashable solid stage, your baby will likely be eating more than just a taste at 2 or 3 meals per day, so you want to try to include those iron and vitamin D rich foods we've talked about. Add pureed spinach to baby's eggs before scrambling them. Include mashable beans as a finger food, just be sure to cut them up. As always, an adjustment period to a new texture is totally normal. Food might come right back out of your baby's mouth. You may notice that he plays more than he did with the last stage of food. He may gag more than he has been. Be attentive, be responsive, and respectful of your baby's signals for more or for being all done. Once your baby is managing the mashable solids that make it to his mouth well, which might be a few meals or a few weeks, he's ready to move on to easy chewables and easy crunchables, which is what I like to call our advanced level foods. Up until this point, all of the foods we've offered could really be safely managed without coordinated chewing. But we really need to see baby chewing and moving foods around his mouth before it's safe to move on. So here are some important red flags. If your baby is 10 to 11 months old and has 2 to 3 months of feeding experience and exposure under his belt, and you're feeling really stuck in those beginner or intermediate foods, so you're not seeing your baby chew no matter what intermediate foods you try, or maybe your baby frequently gags or still pushes food out of the mouth with his tongue, Perhaps he never brings food to his own mouth, or he never opens for a spoon. If he's consistently distressed at mealtimes, then now is a good time to seek some additional help. Request a referral for a feeding evaluation from your child's doctor. If you feel like your concerns are being brushed aside, advocate for your child armed with the knowledge that early intervention is extremely helpful for feeding. The longer a young child struggles at mealtimes with an untreated feeding challenge, the more likely it is that he'll develop negative associations with food that can take much longer to conquer than the original feeding challenge itself. A feeding specialist can take a look at your individual child and his feeding history and put a finger on whether it's a sensory-based challenge, an oral motor-based challenge, or something else that's getting in the way of your kiddo mastering mealtimes. And most importantly, a specialist can give you tools, techniques, and support to help you feel confident. If you're not facing these red flags, it means your baby is ready for advanced foods. Before we jump into the details, let's take a moment to recognize what this milepost on your hike means. Getting to advanced foods means your little one is eating table foods. This is that goal that we've been working towards. It means if you're making spaghetti with meat sauce, you can chop it up and serve it to your baby. It means your little one can eat big person oatmeal and your crock-pot chicken and veggies. While you still want to monitor new foods, in general, it gets harder to isolate single ingredients to introduce at this point. Your baby may be exposed to several new ingredients in a single meal. Just try not to introduce too many new foods at once by keeping the rest of baby's meal old familiars when you introduce a new dish. This is also the part of the adventure when your baby might run across a mixed texture food. Remember, those are the ones that are like a puree with a few lumps and chunks in it. Yogurt with oatmeal is a popular one in our house. By now, your baby likely has developed the sensory and oral motor skills to manage mixed textures in everyday foods, like soups, sauces, or a bowl of cereal with milk. Just be sure to continue to offer all solid foods cut very small. You can see how small I've cut chicken, broccoli, and pasta for my little one here. What sorts of foods fall into this category of easy chewables and easy crunchables? Lots. Pasta noodles, bread and toast with all sorts of spreads like hummus or avocado or cream cheese, ground beef, ground turkey or ground chicken, soft meat from a slow cooker or Dutch oven, ripe pears and peaches, berries and grapes, cut up of course, flake cereals, veggie patties, diced or shredded cheese, zucchini, squash, and on and on. Crackers and other crunchables that crumble and soften fairly easily fall into the category of easy crunchables. But extra crunchy crackers, or those that are brittle and don't soften easily, are best left for older eaters. Here in the United States, I would categorize saltine and Ritz crackers as easy chewables, but pretzels and Triscuits as tough chewables. If you're not quite sure if something's too tricky for your kiddo, you can put it in your own mouth and see how hard it is to soften and chew. Or if you're still worried about it, just trust your gut. You might find an alternative way to offer this food, like dicing and sautéing greens instead of offering them as larger raw leaves, or dicing meat and mixing it into a spread of hummus or avocado. Anything that isn't a tough chewable, our experts only level of foods, is now fair game for your little one. So let's take a look at that final frontier of baby's mealtime journey, tough chewables. These are foods that require the most mature level of chewing and tongue movement skills to safely eat. Tough meats, dried fruits, and fibrous fruits and vegetables like raw apples and lettuce are great examples. Typically, kids don't develop the teeth and the oral motor skills to handle tough chewables until at least 15 months of age, sometimes closer to 2 years of age. My toddler's choking incident was most likely caused by a tough chewable, a too big bite of a super chewy, sticky snack bar. So I can't overstate this enough. Supervise these foods extra closely and wait on them if baby doesn't seem ready or doesn't have molars yet. Your baby can get a very healthy and balanced diet without tough chewables, so there's really no rush. Phew! This was a long lesson and chock full of information. Remember that you can always come back to it or reference the printable field guide when you need it. The biggest things to remember are that different babies will move through these different food textures at different paces. There's no set number of days or weeks to stay on each texture. Instead, you'll need to consider the difficulty of a food texture and your baby's signs of readiness. Let's meet back up in Lesson 3 to talk about teaching your baby how to use utensils.